The tunnel war nobody talks about. Chapter 1, Into the Black Echo. January 8, 1966, 5:30 hours, Ho Bo Woods, Binh Duong Province, South Vietnam. Private First Class Harold Roper crouched at the entrance of a hole barely wider than his shoulders. The opening sat camouflaged beneath dead vegetation and loose earth, its edges reinforced with hardened clay. Above him, the pre-dawn sky flashed with artillery fire as B-52s completed their bombing runs. Around him, 8,000 American and Australian troops from Operation Crimp were sweeping through the jungle, hunting for a Viet Cong headquarters that intelligence promised was hidden somewhere in these woods. But the headquarters wasn't in the woods, it was beneath them. Roper was 20 years old, from Pennsylvania, and weighed 142 pounds. 2 days ago, he'd been a regular infantryman with the 1st Infantry Division. Yesterday, his squad had discovered this hole after a brief firefight. The Viet Cong had appeared from nowhere, fired a burst of AK-47 rounds, and disappeared just as quickly. Roper, his sergeant, had called out, "You're the smallest, get down there and see what's in it." Now, as dawn broke over the Vietnamese jungle, Roper held a standard-issue flashlight in his left hand and a borrowed .45 caliber pistol in his right. He'd never fired a handgun before. The sergeant had given him 3 instructions: don't fire unless you have to, don't go far, and whistle when you come back up so they don't shoot you. Roper dropped his legs into the hole. His boots found purchase on crude earthen steps carved into the wall. He descended slowly, the flashlight beam cutting through absolute darkness. 3 meters down, the vertical shaft ended and a horizontal tunnel began. The passageway was so narrow he had to turn sideways to fit his shoulders through. The ceiling pressed against his helmet. He turned off the flashlight. The darkness that enveloped him was total, primal, suffocating. This was what American soldiers would come to call the Black Echo, the absolute absence of light and sound in the Viet Cong tunnels, where your heartbeat became the loudest thing in the universe. Roper inched forward on his knees, pistol extended, counting his breaths to measure distance. At 30 breaths, roughly 20 meters in, his hand touched something. Wood, crates. He felt along them, counting. 5, 6, 7. A sound stopped his counting. Breathing, not his own, someone else was in the tunnel. Roper's finger found the pistol's trigger. His own breathing had stopped entirely. The sound came again, a soft exhalation maybe 10 meters ahead. He pressed himself against the tunnel wall. Then silence, complete, absolute. Minutes passed. Roper's legs began to cramp. His hand on the pistol was slick with sweat despite the tunnel's coolness. He needed to decide, continue forward into certain contact with the enemy or retreat. He chose retreat. When he finally reached the vertical shaft and saw the circle of grey dawn sky above, relief flooded through him with such intensity that his hands shook as he climbed. He emerged gasping, immediately whistling Yankee Doodle so the infantryman wouldn't shoot. His sergeant pulled him up the last meter. "What you find?" "Supply crates, lots of them, and," Roper paused, "someone else is down there." What Private Roper had discovered would eventually reveal itself to be part of a tunnel network covering over 200 kilometers, extending from the outskirts of Saigon to the Cambodian border. The tunnels contained hospitals, training facilities, headquarters, living quarters, and thousands of Viet Cong fighters who could appear and disappear at will. And Harold Roper, who thought he was a regular infantryman, had just become one of America's first tunnel rats, soldiers who would wage the most claustrophobic, terrifying, and overlooked campaign of the Vietnam War. Chapter 2, The Underground Nation. The Vietnamese had been digging tunnels for generations, first to hide from bandits, then to fight the Chinese, then the Japanese, then the French. By 1948, villagers in the Cu Cai district had already established a basic network, but when the Americans arrived with their overwhelming firepower, the Viet Cong transformed these primitive shelters into something unprecedented, an entire underground civilization. The expansion began in earnest in 1961. Communist engineers and local villagers, working mostly at night with nothing more than hose and baskets, began connecting isolated tunnel segments into an integrated network. The soil itself proved remarkably cooperative. Cu Cai's earth contained high concentrations of iron oxide and clay, which when exposed to air hardened into a cement-like substance. By 1965, when the U.S. 25th Infantry Division established its base camp at Cu Cai, the tunnel network had grown to 200 kilometers of interconnected passages. The Americans had built their base directly on top of one of the most extensive enemy strongholds in South Vietnam, completely unaware that thousands of Viet Cong fighters lived beneath their feet. The tunnel system operated on 3 levels. The upper level, approximately 3 meters below ground, was robust enough to withstand small arms fire and tank treads. The middle level, 6 meters down, contained living quarters and storage facilities. The lowest level, 8 to 10 meters underground, housed hospitals, command centers, and weapons factories. The tunnels themselves were deliberately tiny, between 60 and 80 centimeters wide, 1 to 1.2 meters high. This was just large enough for the average Vietnamese fighter, who stood around 160 centimeters tall and weighed perhaps 50 kilograms. But they were too small for the average American soldier, who stood 178 centimeters and weighed 80 kilograms. The Viet Cong had weaponized their physical size difference. The engineering was sophisticated. Tunnels zigzagged rather than running straight, which dampened explosive blasts. S-bends and right angles every few meters meant you couldn't see more than a body length ahead. Trapdoors separated different levels, often concealed so well that even when you found one tunnel, you'd miss the access to deeper sections. Inside these tunnels, the Viet Cong built an entire society. Underground hospitals had operating rooms equipped with captured medical supplies, where surgeons performed amputations by candlelight. Kitchens existed in larger chambers, their cooking fires vented through multiple shafts to disperse smoke. Meeting rooms hosted planning sessions. Entertainment areas featured small stages where performers would boost fighter morale, with concerts held 50 feet underground. The living conditions, however, were nightmarish. Air was scarce and stale. Food was limited. The tunnels were infested with every form of vermin imaginable: ants, venomous centipedes, scorpions, spiders, and snakes. Disease was rampant: malaria, dysentery, respiratory infections, parasitic worms. Yet the Viet Cong endured. Above ground meant death from American artillery and bombs. Below ground meant survival, however miserable. The Americans initially had no idea this underground world existed. When Viet Cong fighters would appear, attack, and disappear, American commanders were baffled. Personnel at the Cu Kai base reported unexplained equipment damage, supplies stolen, even soldiers killed in their sleeping quarters. Guards maintained constant vigilance, yet enemy infiltrators were somehow entering and exiting at will. The answer seemed impossible. The enemy wasn't infiltrating through the perimeter. They were rising through the ground itself, emerging from tunnel entrances that opened directly inside the American base. On January 7, 1966, Operation Crimp was launched with 8,000 troops, the largest American military operation in Vietnam to date. B-52 bombers dropped 30-ton loads of high explosives. When infantry swept through afterward, what they found changed everything. The headquarters wasn't hidden in the jungle, it was beneath the jungle, and the entrance was a hole in the ground, no bigger than a basketball hoop. Chapter 3: Birth of the Rats. Captain Alexander MacGregor of the Australian 3 Field Troop surveyed the hole his engineers had discovered. Around him, the hobo woods smoldered from the B-52 strike. Yet here, beneath concealing vegetation blown aside by a near-miss bomb, was an opening barely 60 centimeters across. "Right," MacGregor said to Corporal Bob Botel, "let's see where this one leads." The Australians were different from the Americans. Where American commanders viewed tunnel discoveries as problems to be solved with explosives, the Australians saw intelligence opportunities. MacGregor recognized that these tunnels likely contained documents, maps, and weapons vital to understanding enemy capabilities. Someone had to go inside. Botel, a slender man who stood perhaps 165 centimeters tall, volunteered immediately. He took a 9mm pistol and a flashlight. No one had developed specialized tunnel equipment yet. Botel disappeared into the hole at 800 hours on January 9th. An hour passed, 2 hours. At 10:45 hours he emerged, covered in mud, his uniform soaked with sweat. "So you need to see this. Multiple levels. I found rooms with medical supplies, ammunition, and it just keeps going. Too big." Over the next 4 days, MacGregor's men systematically explored the complex. They worked in shifts, crawling through passages so narrow they had to wriggle on their stomachs. They discovered ammunition caches, radio equipment, medical supplies, and most importantly, over 100,000 pages of documents detailing Viet Cong organization and operational plans. They also discovered the traps: punji stakes, sharpened bamboo spears coated with excrement, concealed in false floors, grenades hung from thin wires, tethered snakes, including cobras and bamboo vipers, secured in alcoves with just enough line to strike anyone passing, boxes of scorpions balanced on ledges above tunnel passages. On January 12th, tragedy struck. Corporal Botel was exploring a section when he encountered a trapdoor between levels. He descended and found himself in a passage that gradually narrowed. He continued forward, assuming it would widen again. It didn't. The tunnel became tighter until Botel realized with horror that he was wedged tight, unable to move forward or back. His comrades heard muffled cries and attempted to reach him, but the passage was too narrow. They tried digging from above, but the hardened earth resisted. After 4 hours of desperate rescue attempts, Corporal Robert Botel suffocated to death, wedged in a trapdoor tunnel designed to do exactly that. By January 14th, when Operation Crimp concluded, the Australians had uncovered more than 10 miles of tunnels. 8 Australians had been killed and 29 wounded. American casualties were 14 killed and 76 wounded. At a press conference in Saigon, journalists asked MacGregor about his men's work. "They're tunnel ferrets," MacGregor explained, using a term from his Scottish homeland. An American journalist, unfamiliar with ferrets, misunderstood. "Tunnel rats." "Aye, rats if you like," MacGregor replied. The name stuck. Within weeks, soldiers who entered the tunnels were universally known as tunnel rats. They would adopt the sardonic Latin motto, non gratum anus rodentum, roughly translated as not worth a rat's ass. The American military, finally understanding the scope of the tunnel problem, issued a general order in February 1966. All tunnels discovered must be properly searched before destruction. Captain Herbert Thornton was tasked with creating specialized tunnel clearance teams. He put out a call for volunteers, men smaller than 167 centimeters tall, weighing less than 64 kilograms, psychologically stable, and willing to crawl into pitch-black holes filled with enemy fighters and booby traps. The response was surprisingly strong. Some volunteers were motivated by the challenge. Others volunteered to rotate combat-fatigued comrades out. A few simply figured their small stature finally provided a unique capability. Among the early volunteers was Private First Class C.W. Bowman of the 9th Infantry Regiment. His first tunnel entry came almost by accident. During a patrol, his platoon found a bunker. His sergeant handed him a flashlight and ordered him inside. The bunker was pitch black, Bowman recalled decades later. "I walked slow and straight, didn't look left or right. All I could see was the light at the other end. When I got out, I thought that was pretty cool." His sergeant was less impressed. "Bowman, you just did the dumbest thing I've ever seen. You walked past 3 Viet Cong fighters inside chambers. They let you pass because they didn't want to give away their positions." Despite this near-death introduction, Bowman volunteered to become his unit's designated tunnel rat. The tunnel rats developed their own culture, separate from regular infantry. They were treated with a mixture of respect and superstition. Their unofficial motto, non gratum anus rodentum, captured their self-image. Men who'd volunteered for work that command considered necessary, but no one wanted to acknowledge too closely. The gear was stripped down to essentials. Most rats carried only a pistol, flashlight, and knife. Early rats had descended with helmets and full webbing. They quickly learned that bulk was fatal underground. Helmets caught on low ceilings, webbing snagged on protrusions. Rifles were useless in passages where you couldn't raise your arms. The pistol choice became crucial and controversial. The standard M1911.45 caliber was powerful but problematic. Fired in a confined tunnel, its muzzle blast was so loud it could temporarily deafen the shooter. The blast also revealed your position to any Viet Cong ahead or behind you. Some rats preferred .38 special revolvers, which had lighter report. A few acquired sound suppressors, which made the weapon much quieter. The most unconventional equipment came from individual improvisation. Private Nicholas Sansa, who served as a tunnel rat from 1971 onward, developed his own tools. He carried a 3.5-foot bamboo stick with a slit cut in one end, useful for feeling ahead in darkness and detecting trip wires. His other weapon was a 14-inch Japanese bayonet for hand-to-hand encounters. "These 2 weapons kept me alive," Sansa told interviewers. "If it wasn't for my designed weapons, the tunnels would have been my grave." Sansa adopted extreme tactics. He didn't shower for weeks, covered himself in mud, ate only Vietnamese food, and wore black pajamas identical to Viet Cong uniforms. This eliminated the distinctive American scents, soap, cigarettes, processed food, that could betray a tunnel rat in the darkness. Chapter 4: The Traps and the Terror. January 18, 1967, 1400 hours, Ku Kai District. Sergeant Robert Hayes descended into another tunnel during Operation Cedar Falls. This entrance looked identical to the dozens he'd explored during his 8 months as a tunnel rat. 20 meters in, his left hand felt a depression in the wall, a small alcove. He carefully reached into it. His fingers touched rope, then scales, then movement. The kite struck at his hand, but Hayes had already jerked back. The snake, tethered with just enough rope to reach the tunnel's center, lunged repeatedly. Hayes waited until it exhausted itself, then used his knife to cut the restraining rope and push the serpent deeper into the alcove. Tethered snake alcove left wall, 20 meters in. he whispered into his communication wire. Hayes continued forward. 40 meters from the entrance, the tunnel descended steeply. At the bottom, 6 meters below the original level, he found a chamber approximately 2 meters square. He risked his flashlight for 3 seconds. Empty, but his light caught something. A thin wire stretched across the tunnel exit, positioned at ankle height. In absolute darkness, his fingers traced the wire. It connected to a bamboo tube embedded in the ceiling on one side, and what felt like a grenade on the other wall. Hayes understood immediately. Trip the wire, and the bamboo tube would release scorpions or spiders onto whoever triggered it. The grenade on the other wall was a double trap. If you tried to disarm it from that side, you'd trigger a secondary explosive. He carefully cut the wire, holding both ends to prevent tension release from triggering either trap. He removed the bamboo tube and carried it back to the entrance. Topside, his team opened it carefully. 43 scorpions spilled out. This was typical of the tunnel rats' daily encounters, not firefights, but an endless chess match with booby traps designed by guerrillas who'd been refining tunnel warfare for 2 decades. The Viet Cong trap repertoire was extensive and diabolical. Beyond tethered snakes and scorpion boxes, there were punji pits concealed under thin clay that would collapse onto sharpened stakes coated with excrement. Tripwire grenades were positioned in clusters, so disarming one would trigger another. False floors concealed spikes. Trap doors led to dead-end passages designed to wedge and suffocate intruders. Some traps were psychological. The Viet Cong would leave tunnels deliberately easy to enter, allowing tunnel rats to penetrate deep before sealing exits behind them. Other tunnels contained chambers filled with decomposing bodies, American soldiers who'd been captured, killed, and left to rot. Beyond the traps were the close-quarters encounters. When a tunnel rat met a Viet Cong fighter underground, the resulting combat was unlike anything else in modern warfare. Both men would be in near-total darkness, confined to a space barely large enough for one person. Firing a weapon was a last resort. The muzzle flash blinded you, the sound deafened you, and ricochets could kill the shooter. Most tunnel encounters were decided by hand-to-hand combat using knives. Sergeant Jim Knight described one such encounter. I felt him before I saw him. His hand touched my boot in the darkness. We both froze, then we both lunged. In that narrow tunnel, we couldn't really fight, we could only grapple. I got my knife out and stabbed blindly. He did the same. One of us was going to die in the next 30 seconds. It happened to be him. The psychological stress was compounded by the enemy's home ground advantage. The Viet Cong knew every turn, every chamber, every trap. They could navigate in total darkness with confidence while tunnel rats fumbled into the unknown. The Viet Cong could wait, time was their ally. Nicholas Sansa described the mental game. You had to think like them. They expected you to use your flashlight, so you didn't. They expected you to move forward, so sometimes you'd wait. They expected American soldiers to smell like Americans, so I made sure I didn't. It was psychological warfare in pitch darkness. The fear was universal among tunnel rats, though most would only acknowledge it decades later. In the moment, the fear had to be suppressed, channeled into hypervigilance, but the cumulative effect was devastating. C.W. Bowman served as a tunnel rat for his entire tour, descending more than 50 times. After a while, he recalled, you developed a sixth sense. You could feel danger before you encountered it. Your body knew before your brain did that something was wrong ahead. But the sixth sense came at a cost. Tunnel rats developed chronic anxiety, claustrophobia that persisted for decades. Many couldn't sleep in rooms with closed doors. Medical records showed dramatically higher rates of psychological casualties compared to regular infantry. By 1968, the tunnel rat community had developed an unofficial hierarchy. New tunnel rats were called cherries and were mentored by veterans. The learning curve was steep and unforgiving. Veterans estimated that about 60% of tunnel rats were killed or seriously wounded during their first 10 tunnel entries. If you survived those first 10, your odds improved dramatically. One crucial lesson: never continue forward if something feels wrong. Experienced tunnel rats developed an almost mystical trust in their instincts. Pride got tunnel rats killed. Caution kept them alive. Another lesson: respect your enemy. The Viet Cong tunnel fighters were specially trained soldiers who'd volunteered for tunnel defense. Many spent years living underground, becoming so adapted to darkness they could navigate and fight with efficiency American tunnel rats could never match. Chapter 5: The Underground Battles. March 19, 1967, 11:30 hours, Iron Triangle. Specialist James Lindsay and his 3-man tunnel rat team had discovered an entrance near the ruined village of Ben Suc. The entrance was larger than typical, nearly a meter wide, and the shaft descended straight down 15 meters. Lindsay went first, followed by Corporal Danny Thornton. At the bottom, they found a chamber large enough to stand upright. 3 tunnels branched from it. Lindsay chose the left passage. 50 meters in, the tunnel opened into another chamber. Lindsay's flashlight revealed a complete underground hospital. Surgical table, shelves with medical supplies, bottles labeled in English, antibiotics, morphine, surgical tools, blood stains on the floor, and in one corner a trapdoor. They descended into the 3rd level, now 25 meters underground. The air was noticeably thinner. The tunnel at this level was wider, showing evidence of long-term use. After 30 meters, it opened into the largest chamber either man had encountered, approximately 5 meters square. His flashlight revealed the chamber's purpose: command center. Maps covered one wall showing American base positions. A captured American radio sat on a table. Documents were stacked in crates. 7 sleeping mats indicated this housed multiple officers. Lindsay was gathering documents when Thornton touched his shoulder and pointed. On the far side, partially concealed behind a screen, was another tunnel entrance. But from this tunnel came a faint glow, artificial light from somewhere deeper. That light meant people, active occupation. Lindsay made a decision. Instead of retreating and calling for reinforcements, he decided to investigate. He extinguished his flashlight and approached carefully. He could hear voices, Vietnamese, multiple speakers. Lindsay signaled Thornton. 5 enemy fighters, possibly more, just ahead. They advanced toward the voices. If they encountered 5 armed Viet Cong in that confined space, both Americans would likely die. They reached the turn. Lindsay risked a glance around the corner. 6 Viet Cong soldiers sat around a small fire, eating rice. Their AK-47 rifles leaned against the wall, within reach but not in hand. They were relaxed, confident in their underground sanctuary's security. Lindsay pulled a grenade from his webbing, pulled the pin, counted 2 seconds, and threw it around the corner. Then he and Thornton ran. The explosion in the confined space was catastrophic. The blast wave caught both Americans, slamming them against tunnel walls. But they kept moving, scrambling back toward the command center, back toward the vertical shaft, up toward the surface. Behind them, the tunnel complex began collapsing. The grenade's blast had destabilized the chamber's structural integrity. Tons of earth were moving, crushing. The tunnel rat's worst nightmare, live burial, was becoming reality. They emerged into daylight at 12:47 hours, both covered in mud, bleeding from ears and nose. Behind them, the tunnel entrance belched dust and collapsed inward. The entire complex had been destroyed. But so had the intelligence. The documents, maps, radio equipment, all buried, and the 6 Viet Cong fighters had died without revealing anything. Captain Vernon Morris, the intelligence officer who debriefed them, was furious. "You destroyed the most significant tunnel complex we've discovered in 6 months. We could have captured prisoners. We could have seized intact documents. Instead, we have nothing." Lindsay responded, "So with respect, we're alive, that's something." The incident illustrated the fundamental tension in tunnel warfare: intelligence value versus survival. Command wanted prisoners and documents. Tunnel rats wanted to survive. The 2 objectives often conflicted. The Americans tried various tactics to neutralize tunnels without sending men inside. They pumped tear gas into entrances. The Viet Cong sealed themselves in lower levels with wet cloths. They pumped water to flood tunnels. The Viet Cong had watertight doors. They used smoke generators to trace air shafts. The Viet Cong had dozens of exits. German shepherd dogs were trained to detect tunnel entrances. The dogs suffered high casualties from booby traps. Many became psychologically traumatized, refusing to approach entrances. The program was discontinued. Technology was deployed. Seismic sensors, acoustic listening devices, nothing worked effectively. By late 1967, American command grudgingly accepted there was no substitute for human tunnel rats. Between 1966 and 1972, approximately 700 American soldiers served as tunnel rats. Of these, roughly 200 died in the tunnels or from wounds received underground. Many more were wounded. The survival rate was among the lowest in Vietnam. Chapter 6: The Last Descent. April 15, 1971, Tay Ninh Province. Sergeant Jim Knight prepared for what would be his final tunnel descent. He'd been a tunnel rat for 18 months, far longer than recommended. His commanding officer had tried to reassign him multiple times. Knight had refused, feeling obligation to continue work few others would do. This tunnel had been discovered near the Cambodian border. Initial exploration revealed a large complex, possibly a regional headquarters. Knight volunteered to conduct a thorough search. He descended at 900 hours. The tunnel extended deep through multiple levels. He discovered chambers containing supplies, documents, and evidence of recent occupation. 4 hours into his exploration, deep in the third level, Knight encountered something he'd never seen. A blast door constructed from heavy timber reinforced with metal straps, secured with a sophisticated lock. Knight examined it carefully. He could probably open it. The question was whether he should. Behind that door could be anything: a command center, a weapons cache, a trap, or a dead end. He made his decision. He began working on the lock. 30 minutes later, he heard the mechanism click. He pulled the door open slowly, his pistol ready. Beyond was a chamber unlike any Knight had encountered. It was large, perhaps 5 meters square, with a ceiling high enough to stand, and it was occupied. 3 Viet Cong officers sat at a table, maps and documents spread before them. They looked up as the door opened, as surprised to see Knight as he was to see them. Then everyone moved. Knight fired first, hitting one officer. He fired again as the others dove for cover. The chamber erupted in return fire from guards in alcoves he'd missed. Knight retreated through the door, slammed it closed, and ran. Behind him, the Viet Cong were shouting, organizing pursuit. He had perhaps 30 seconds head start. He scrambled through the tunnel network, no longer mapping, simply fleeing. He reached the first vertical shaft and climbed frantically. Behind him, pursuit continued, footsteps, voices, weapons being readied. Knight emerged into Vietnamese sunshine at 13:47 hours, nearly 4.5 hours after descending. He was bleeding from wounds he hadn't noticed. His uniform was torn, his pistol was empty, and he was shouting for his security team to prepare for enemy emergence. They took positions around the entrance. Minutes passed, no one emerged. The Viet Cong had either turned back or taken alternative exits. Knight sat down heavily, his hands shaking. Captain Morrison approached. "What happened down there?" "I found them, sir, officers, a command post. I engaged and had to retreat, but sir," Knight paused, "I've been doing this for 18 months. That's the first time I saw living Viet Cong underground conducting operations. They were working, planning, living their lives down there." Morrison studied his tunnel rat. "What's your point?" "My point, sir, is that we're not winning this war. They live underground, they operate from underground, and we send people like me down there with pistols, hoping to somehow neutralize a network built over decades. It's impossible." "You volunteering to quit?" "No, sir, I'm volunteering to never go down there again. Someone else's turn." Morrison nodded. "Approved. You're off tunnel duty, effective immediately." Jim Knight never entered another tunnel. He completed his tour and returned to the United States in August 1971. He never spoke publicly about his experiences until 1988. "What do you want me to say?" he asked a documentary filmmaker. "That it was heroic? It wasn't. It was terrifying. That we were brave. We were scared every single time. That it mattered. Maybe we found some intelligence, killed some enemy fighters, but the tunnels survived. The Viet Cong survived, and 4 years later they won the war." Chapter 7: The Legacy. The Tunnel War of Vietnam was fought by perhaps 700 American soldiers and thousands of Vietnamese fighters. It occurred beneath the notice of cameras, beyond the reach of journalists, in darkness so complete that combatants often never saw their enemies. Approximately 200 American tunnel rats died underground. Hundreds more were wounded. All were psychologically damaged. Vietnamese casualties were certainly higher, but exact figures were never recorded. Statistics cannot capture the human dimension. They cannot describe the absolute darkness, the suffocating fear, the certainty of death around every turn. They cannot convey what it meant to crawl through passages barely larger than your body, knowing that enemy fighters, venomous snakes, and explosive traps waited ahead. The tunnel rats represented a peculiar form of heroism, not the glory of beach landings or aerial combat, but the quiet courage of doing an impossible job simply because someone had to. They exemplified American values: volunteerism, sacrifice, determination against overwhelming odds. Yet they also embodied American limitations. All the technology and firepower couldn't solve the tunnel problem. It required individual soldiers making individual choices in darkness, far from any support, relying entirely on their own judgment and courage. The Viet Cong understood this. They built their tunnels knowing American technology would be useless underground. They created an environment where their physical size was an advantage, where their knowledge of terrain was decisive. The tunnels were genius in their simplicity, just holes in the ground that negated American military superiority. Today, the Ku Kai tunnels are a museum. The Iron Triangle tunnels are mostly collapsed, but their legacy persists. Modern militaries still face tunnel warfare. Hamas in Gaza, ISIS in Iraq and Syria all use underground networks, and the solutions remain limited. The tunnel rat mission continues in different theaters, with different soldiers facing the same primal challenge: enter the darkness and survive. Harold Roper, one of the first tunnel rats, attended a reunion in 2003. He spoke openly for the first time about his first descent in January 1966. "I've lived 57 years, he told the group, but I've never stopped being in that tunnel. Every dark room, every basement, every tight space, I'm back there feeling the walls closing in, hearing breathing that isn't mine, certain I'm about to die. The war ended in 1973, but for tunnel rats it never ended. We're still underground." His words resonated because they were universal. The darkness stayed with them. The fear never fully retreated. C.W. Bowman, who made over 50 tunnel descents, captured the essence in a 2008 interview. "People ask if I was brave. I wasn't. I was terrified every single time. But I'd volunteered, my unit counted on me, and other men were doing jobs just as dangerous. So I kept going down. You didn't think about bravery. You thought about surviving the next hour, the next passage, the next encounter. That's all." That statement encapsulates the tunnel rats' legacy. They were not superheroes. They were ordinary young men who found themselves assigned to an extraordinary mission. They adapted, survived, and in some cases, excelled at work that should have been impossible. The tunnel rats deserve recognition not just for their courage, but for their service in a conflict that exemplified everything difficult about Vietnam. They fought an enemy who was simultaneously invisible and omnipresent, who controlled terrain through patience and willpower rather than firepower. They fought in an environment that negated every American advantage. Their motto, non gratum anus rodentum, was self-deprecating humor masking profound truth. They felt they weren't worth a rat's ass, but they did the job regardless. They descended into the Black Echo because someone had to. In the end, the tunnel war was won by neither side. The Americans couldn't eliminate the tunnels. The Vietnamese couldn't prevent their exploration. When the war ended, the tunnels remained, empty now, abandoned, slowly collapsing, but still there, still defiant. The tunnel rats knew this truth. They learned it in the darkness, in the fear, in the countless moments when survival seemed impossible but somehow occurred. They learned it from enemies they never saw, from traps they barely avoided, from comrades who descended and never returned. And they carry that truth with them still. In every dark room, every enclosed space, every moment when memory returns unbidden, they're back in the tunnels, back in the darkness, back in a war that never fully ended for those who fought beneath the ground. The tunnel war nobody talks about. The conflict hidden beneath the larger war, fought in absolute darkness by men whose courage couldn't be photographed or witnessed by anyone except the enemy trying to kill them. They were the tunnel rats, and their story deserves to be told.